"Stop moving or I'll put a bullet in your head right now." He barked the threat before she even spoke, never imagining that this single sentence would not only end his career, but tear apart an entire sheriff's department under the unforgiving glare of a Florida afternoon. Colonel Serena Washington stood beside her black SUV with both hands raised high, palms open, the sunlight reflecting off her skin like a silent witness that refused to blink. She followed every command. She offered no resistance. She stood exactly where he ordered her to stand, yet in one violent motion that stunned every tourist, every family, and every student stuck in traffic. The deputy lifted his gun, pressed the barrel toward her left ear, and fired. The shot cracked across the interstate like a hammer on steel. Blood misted onto the white lane markings. Serena collapsed with a sharp cry as her hearing was stolen forever in the span of a single breath. People screamed, phones shook, and the Florida sun, bright and merciless, made sure that no one could lie about what happened. So now the question becomes simple. When a man fires on an unarmed woman in broad daylight, with 50 cameras rolling, is anyone truly surprised when karma arrives before the echo even fades? Before we begin this story, tell me where you are watching from, and if you believe these truths must be spoken clearly and without fear. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so more people can hear the stories that daylight refuses to hide. The morning had begun with pride, celebration, and calm. Eglin Air Force Base was alive with families, veterans, and young soldiers who had come to witness a moment they knew was historic. Serena Washington stood in the center of the reviewing field, her posture strong, her expression still, her uniform immaculate under the clear Florida sky. For 20 years she had carried the weight of duty with quiet resolve. Today was the day that resolve was recognized with a promotion she had earned through sacrifice, discipline, and one extraordinary act of courage. Months earlier, she had rescued a pregnant woman from a hostage crisis that could have ended in tragedy. The woman survived. The baby survived. The deputy married to that woman would later become the first man inside his department to break the silence and expose corruption. But none of those future events were on Serena's mind. Today, she stood as a soldier honored for her service. The ceremony began with applause that rolled gently across the field. Captain Isaiah Brooks stepped forward with the Silver Eagles in his palm. He spoke briefly about leadership, integrity, and the weight of responsibility that comes with rank. Then he pinned the insignia to Serena's shoulders. She felt the cool metal settle against her uniform and allowed herself one quiet breath of gratitude. Cameras clicked, children waved flags, veterans nodded with recognition. Serena saluted with steady confidence as the crowd rose to its feet in appreciation of a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting others. She spent the next hour greeting families, answering questions from young soldiers, and speaking kindly to parents who feared for their children serving overseas. Every gesture was thoughtful. Every word was patient. That was who Serena had always been. Calm, steady, clear-minded. She posed with children who tugged at her sleeves and asked if she could teach them how to be brave. She shook hands with retired officers who told her she gave them hope. She offered encouragement to a young medic who felt uncertain about her future. Serena never hurried. She valued people. She listened. She understood the burden service places on families and the honor that comes when a community stands behind you. When the ceremony ended, shortly before noon, Serena changed into a light shirt for the drive home, folded her uniform jacket neatly on the back seat, and placed her military cap beside it. Her black SUV still carried the colonel's license plate she had received years earlier. The Army sticker on her windshield was faded slightly by the sun, but unmistakable. She drove east toward Destin with the window halfway down and the warm breeze filling the cabin. The interstate was crowded with spring break tourists, families pulling campers, and beachgoers singing along to loud music. Nothing about the afternoon suggested danger. The sky was clear. The sunlight was strong. The entire highway moved in unhurried waves. Serena kept her hands steady on the wheel. She drove the way she lived, disciplined and patient. She thought about her niece, who had been asking for help with a school project. She thought about calling her mother that evening. She thought about Monday's briefing and the young officer she promised to mentor. Her life was full, purposeful, and stable. She deserved a quiet drive home after a morning of honor. For a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the simple peace. Then the peace broke. Sirens sliced through traffic behind her. Serena checked her mirror, expecting a pursuit, but instead saw two Okaloosa County Patrol SUVs swerving aggressively through lanes. They cut off drivers. They forced cars to the shoulder. They moved too fast and too recklessly for routine enforcement. People lifted their phones immediately. Dash cams recorded everything by default. Serena slowed, unsure of their target. Then one SUV veered sharply and boxed her in. The second lurched in front of her, forcing her to brake. Serena turned on her hazard lights, kept both hands visible, and calmly lowered her window. She had been stopped before. She knew the protocol better than most civilians. She had followed it her entire career. But the deputies did not approach like men conducting a standard traffic stop. They approached with hostility already burning behind their eyes. Derek Harlan, the man who would soon become the center of national outrage, leapt out first. His gun was drawn before he reached her door. Travis McAllister followed with the same aggression. Marcus Reed, slower and less certain, stepped out last. Serena offered her ID. She spoke respectfully. She answered every command. Derek snatched her military identification, glanced at it, and flung it onto the asphalt where anyone with a phone could record the insult. Serena inhaled slowly, raising her hands even higher, palms open to the sun. She had complied with everything. She stood unarmed, unthreatening, and visible under clear daylight that left no shadows to distort the truth. But hatred does not wait for cause, and cruelty does not pause for reason. The man with the badge made his choice, and the world would soon watch it play out in every corner of the country. And this was only the beginning. At 2:47 p.m., under a sky so clear it erased the possibility of confusion, two Okaloosa County Patrol SUVs lunged across 3 lanes of Interstate 10 and boxed in Colonel Serena Washington with the precision of men who had already decided she was guilty of something. Traffic screeched, tourists gasped, phones rose in every direction. Derek Harlan jumped out first, gun drawn, his face hardened by a rage Serena had never earned. Travis McAllister followed with the same reckless posture. Marcus Reed stepped out slower, his expression tense, already sensing that something was wrong but too afraid to challenge the momentum of the moment. Serena lowered her window, kept both hands visible, and spoke with calm clarity, her voice steady from years of command. Derek ignored every word. He yanked her ID from her hand, glanced at the military insignia, and flung it onto the asphalt as if her rank, her service, and her humanity carried no weight at all. The gesture was violent in its disrespect, loud enough for families in nearby cars to hear, shocking enough that several people recorded it instantly. The Florida sun illuminated everything with sharp honesty. Nothing was obscured, nothing was distorted. Every angle was captured by phones, dash cams, and even a news helicopter that hovered nearby for routine traffic coverage. Derek shouted orders Serena had already obeyed. She stepped out of the vehicle slowly, hands raised above her shoulders, palms open, standing exactly where he told her to stand. She posed no threat. She held nothing. She moved with deliberate care, yet Derek treated her as if she were a danger he needed to eliminate. He circled her with a posture that looked less like law enforcement and more like someone seeking justification for a decision he had already made. The situation escalated without cause. A child in a nearby minivan cried. A tourist whispered that the colonel was complying. A teacher on spring break murmured that the scene felt wrong. But Derek was lost in a surge of hostility that drowned out reason. He shouted again, louder, pointing his weapon directly at Serena's face despite the empty hands lifted above her head. Travis tried to control the crowd by waving his arm at bystanders, but the daylight made his efforts useless. People were not going to stop recording. They had seen too much already. Serena inhaled slowly, maintaining her posture. She spoke once more, reminding the deputies that she was a colonel in the United States Army and that she would continue doing exactly as instructed. Derek responded not with acknowledgement, but with a step forward that signaled finality. In the cold logic of cruelty, he had made up his mind. What happened next unfolded with devastating speed. Derek holstered his weapon for one brief second, as if calming himself. Then in the same motion drew it again and pressed the barrel toward Serena's left ear. His finger tightened around the trigger without hesitation, without fear, without a hint of professional restraint. The gunshot cracked through the humid afternoon air. It echoed against the vehicles. It cut through the voices of the crowd. It carried across the interstate with a force that turned every witness into a reluctant participant in a tragedy they could not stop. Blood sprayed onto the white lane markings, bright against the pavement. Serena collapsed instantly, her vision blurring, her hearing disappearing in a silent burst of pain so sharp it felt like the world had been erased. She pressed her hand against the wound, feeling warmth spill through her fingers as she fought to stay conscious. She had survived battlefields. She had faced armed men overseas. She had endured every test of leadership the Army demanded. But she had never imagined that the greatest danger she would face would come from a man wearing an American badge on an American highway. The interstate erupted into chaos. People screamed. A mother shielded her children's eyes. A group of college students shouted for someone to call 911 even though the deputies were supposed to be the emergency responders. Derek stepped back, breathing hard, as if surprised by the violence he had created, but unwilling to acknowledge the gravity of what he had done. Travis froze, momentarily stunned by the shockwave of the shot. Marcus Reed stared at the fallen woman with a kind of horror that struck him in the center of his conscience. He knew Serena. He knew her role in saving his wife during the hostage crisis. He knew this was the woman who had lifted his family out of the darkest moment of their lives. And now he had watched his fellow deputy shoot her for nothing more than existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment in a country that still allowed prejudice to wear a uniform. The news helicopter pilot reacted instantly, tilting the camera downward, capturing the scene from directly above with perfect clarity. The entire shooting streamed live on local television before Serena was even lifted from the ground. The footage spread faster than the sirens could move. Onlookers uploaded videos to social media. Within minutes, the shooting appeared on thousands of screens across the country. The bright sunlight made every detail impossible to deny. Serena's hands were raised. Her posture was compliant. Her voice had been calm. Derek's violence had been unprovoked and deliberate. No statement, no report, no official explanation could twist what millions of people had just seen with their own eyes. Serena tried to stay alert. She fought the darkness pulling at her vision. The pavement burned against her cheek. She tasted blood in her mouth. She felt a rush of fear, not for her life, but for the possibility that her silence would allow the truth to be reshaped by those determined to protect their own. She tried to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. Her hearing faded. The world became muted. She saw only shapes, faces leaning over her, hands reaching out, a blur of blue uniforms, a blur of civilian clothing. She wanted to raise her hand in acknowledgement, but her arm refused to move. Marcus Reed, trembling, stepped forward. He knelt beside her despite Derek's order to stay back. He whispered her name, hoping she could hear him. She could not. He whispered an apology. She did not respond, but he knew this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. He could not undo it. He could not justify it. He could not hide it. And he knew that today, under the brightest sky in Florida, the truth would no longer belong to the sheriff, the deputies, or the official reports. It belonged to the cameras. It belonged to the witnesses. It belonged to the world. And the world had only just begun to watch. Colonel Serena Washington lay on the hot pavement of Interstate 10 with blood pooling beneath her cheek, the sunlight pressing against her skin with the same intensity as the pain pulsing through her skull. And in the first seconds after the gunshot, her world collapsed into a silence so complete it felt like the sky itself had vanished. She tried to lift her head, but the motion sent a sharp wave of agony through her temple. Forcing her back down, she could see the shapes of people around her, moving quickly, calling out, pointing, recording, crying, but she could not hear a single voice. The world had become a moving picture without sound. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the edges of the scene kept dissolving into light. Her thoughts scattered. She remembered the ceremony. She remembered Isaiah pinning the silver eagles onto her shoulders. She remembered the applause. She remembered the pride. Now all she could feel was the heavy warmth of her own blood sliding down her jaw. She swallowed, tasting iron. She tried to speak. No words formed. Her breath trembled. But even in this disorienting fog, a single truth burned through her mind. She had survived the battlefield. She had survived men who wanted her dead. She would survive this. The interstate had erupted into a wave of panic the moment the bullet tore through the air. Cars stopped abruptly in every lane. Doors opened. People ran toward Serena, their voices rising in shock and disbelief. Though she could not hear them, a mother clutched her son, whispering prayers he would remember years later. A college student dropped his phone from shaking hands, then picked it up and held it steady because he knew the world needed to see what was happening. A retired Marine pushed through the crowd, shouting for space so someone with medical training could reach her, his voice breaking with anger at the sight of a fellow service member bleeding on American asphalt. But the clearest movement came from one man trapped in the traffic jam 30 yards behind her. Dr. Elias Grant, an emergency room physician leaving a grueling hospital shift, saw the commotion, saw the deputies waving their arms, saw the crowd pointing downward, and without hesitation grabbed his medical bag and sprinted forward. He did not wait for permission. He did not ask questions. He saw a wounded soldier and reacted as instinctively as he would in any trauma bay. He dropped to his knees beside Serena, his hands already gloved, his voice calm and firm even though she could not hear him. He pressed gauze against the wound behind her ear. He checked her pulse. He monitored her breathing. He moved with the practiced discipline of a man who had saved hundreds of lives but had never treated a political crime unfolding under a sky so bright it erased every excuse the shooters might later claim. As Elias worked, Derek Harlan and Travis McAllister tried to contain the crowd with frantic gestures, shouting that people needed to step back. Though the people no longer trusted the voices coming from the uniforms responsible for the shooting, the public did not retreat. They stood their ground. They filmed every second. Some shouted for the deputies to drop their weapons. Others called 911, not realizing that the shooters were the ones who were supposed to be the responders. Derek's voice cracked with fear that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with control slipping from his hands. Travis looked from the crowd to the wounded colonel, then back to Derek, as if searching for some justification that would never appear. On the far edge of the chaos, Marcus Reed stood frozen, his hand trembling over his radio, unable to speak because the truth had punched through him with the same force as the gunshot that struck Serena. He saw her face. He saw the blood staining the pavement, and in that instant, he felt the weight of his own silence pressing down on him like a sentence he had imposed on himself. She had saved his wife. She had saved his daughter. She had risked her life in a dark room months earlier so that his family could remain whole. And he had let a violent man with a badge turn that same woman into a victim on a sunny interstate where every civilian could see the injustice he had failed to confront. It took 7 minutes for the first video to go viral. 7 minutes for the footage to leave the highway and tear across social media. 7 minutes for millions of people to see Serena with her hands raised high and Derek pressing the gun to her ear. 7 minutes for the silence surrounding this department to begin collapsing. Lydia Reed was at home on her sofa, 8 months pregnant, watching television with her feet elevated when the breaking news banner flashed across the screen. She saw the helicopter footage. She saw the black SUV. She saw the wounded woman. And in the next second, she recognized the face. Her breath caught. She pressed her hand to her stomach. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "That is the woman who saved our baby." Her entire body trembled as she reached for her phone, praying Marcus would answer, praying he was not part of what she was seeing. Meanwhile, on the interstate, the scene grew more intense. More people arrived, more phones pointed, more voices shouted questions that Serena could not hear. Elias continued working, his hands steady, his movements efficient. He looked up at Derek once, his expression carrying a message Serena herself could not speak. It was a message of moral disgust, of disappointment, of the deep sorrow that medical professionals feel when violence replaces reason. Derek stepped back, his face reddening, his jaw tight. He tried to assert control by ordering Elias away, but the crowd pushed forward with their cameras raised, refusing to let the man interfering with life-saving care dictate another moment of cruelty. Derek hesitated, his authority unraveling in the daylight. Paramedics arrived 10 minutes after the shooting, weaving through rows of parked vehicles. They lifted Serena gently, placed an oxygen mask over her face, and loaded her into the ambulance. Elias stayed beside her until the doors closed, telling her, even though she could not hear, that she was still here, that she was still fighting, that she would not be left alone. Serena drifted between consciousness and the heavy pull of shock, her world still wrapped in silence, unable to hear the siren that began to wail as the ambulance pulled away. She stared at the bright sky through the rear window and tried to hold on to one thought. She was alive. And as long as she was alive, the truth could not be buried. But what she could not yet know was that the truth had already spread farther than the ambulance traveled. The world had seen what happened. The world had heard the gunshot she no longer could. The world had begun to move, and nothing would be able to stop what came next. The first viral clip hit Twitter before Serena's ambulance reached the exit ramp. And within moments, the nation understood something that Okaloosa County officials had tried to bury for years. The sun exposes everything. From the moment the bullet struck Serena, daylight had taken ownership of the truth. And nothing Sheriff Clayton Wheeler or his loyal Sergeant Travis McAllister could do would ever push that truth back into the shadows. At 3:10 p.m., as drivers sat trapped in miles of traffic behind the shooting, Miami Herald reporter Tamara Jones watched the footage on her phone. She had been preparing for a quiet afternoon, but the image of a black woman in civilian clothing with her hands fully raised, and a deputy placing his gun against her ear, ignited something that felt less like curiosity and more like obligation. She grabbed her bag, ran to her car, and sped toward Interstate 10 with the kind of urgency reserved for stories that change the course of public history. She knew from experience that daylight crimes collapse faster than nighttime lies, and she intended to document every piece of evidence before officials had time to rewrite a single sentence. 20 minutes later, while Tamara raced north, Special Agent Naomi Park of the FBI's Jacksonville Division received the same footage on her government line. Naomi watched the 7-second clip 3 times. Each time her expression hardened further. Serena's palms were open, her shoulders were relaxed, her body fell exactly when the muzzle flashed. There was no threat, no motion, no justification. Naomi closed the video, stood from her desk, and ordered an immediate deployment to the scene. She took the helicopter because she needed to reach the interstate before the county's leadership could contaminate evidence, intimidate witnesses, or build the foundation of a false narrative. She knew how fast corruption could move when cornered. She knew how quickly reports could be rewritten, timestamps edited, and body camera files erased. And she knew this case would ignite national consequences the moment sunlight met federal authority. When Naomi landed on the shoulder of Interstate 10, the sound of the helicopter blades drowned out the last remnants of chaos. Paramedics had already taken Serena. Civilians were still holding their phones, speaking over one another, describing what they had seen. Naomi stepped onto the pavement, her face calm but focused, her badge displayed, her voice measured and clear. She asked witnesses to form a line. She collected names. She collected statements. She collected phones from people willing to voluntarily airdrop or email the footage directly to her field device. She worked with the precision of someone who understood that daylight was her partner and the truth was her jurisdiction. Then she walked toward the scene where the shooting occurred and studied the blood pattern on the asphalt. The sun illuminated every detail. The spatter was forward. The entry point aligned with Serena's raised hands. The distance was close enough to eliminate claims of sudden threat. Naomi took photos. She recorded exact angles. She documented everything. And while she worked, the deputies responsible stood several yards away, their faces pale, their voices low, their confidence gone. Derek Harlan tried to claim that his body camera had malfunctioned, but his explanation collapsed instantly when Naomi retrieved the device, pressed the power button, and discovered that it turned on without issue. The internal storage, however, was empty, entirely empty. Not a single file, not a single fragment, not a single corrupted clip, just the unmistakable silence of deliberate erasure. Travis McAllister attempted to step toward her, offering a quick explanation filled with technical excuses. But Naomi raised her hand and stopped him mid-sentence with a calm force that made it clear she was not interested in speculation or performance. She informed him that tampering with evidence would be charged as a federal offense. She informed Derek that he should not speak further without representation, and she informed both men that the daylight had already preserved everything they hoped to hide, thanks to dozens of civilian cameras that worked far better than their missing footage ever had. While Naomi secured the scene, Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the interstate, unable to escape the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Derek. He looked at the blood stain that had not yet dried in the sun. And he felt something break open inside him, something that had been held shut by fear, loyalty, and silence. He thought of Lydia. He thought of the night Serena saved her life. He thought of the quiet gratitude he had carried since then, and he thought of the unbearable shame he now felt for standing beside men who believed violence was a tool and silence was protection. When Naomi approached him, expecting resistance like she had received from Derek and Travis, she was surprised by the calm steadiness in his eyes. Marcus did not deny anything. He did not defend anyone. He reached into his patrol SUV, removed a flash drive wrapped in a rubber band, and placed it directly into Naomi's hand. The drive contained internal complaints buried by Sheriff Wheeler, 3 previous reports of excessive force by Derek, each dismissed, each minimized, each filed away as if the lives affected did not matter. The drive contained evidence that Wheeler had personally intervened to protect Derek from suspension. The drive contained emails from Travis instructing a junior deputy to remove unnecessary details before forwarding files to the state attorney's office. The drive contained a pattern of misconduct that stretched back 4 years. Naomi scrolled through the first folder and closed her eyes briefly. Not out of frustration, but out of recognition. She had seen this pattern in other counties. She had testified against this pattern before. She understood exactly what she was holding. The sunlight gleamed across the metal edge of the flash drive, almost as if the day itself was demanding that these secrets finally come into public view. As Naomi began securing the evidence, Tamara Jones arrived, parking her car several yards away and stepping out with her press identification visible. She did not interrupt the federal investigation. She stood back, observing, capturing images, speaking quietly to witnesses who had finished with Naomi. She understood the gravity of the moment. She understood that this was not just a local shooting, but the beginning of a jurisdictional collapse that would ripple across the state. She knew the story would reach Washington before midnight. But more importantly, she knew Serena's name would not be forgotten, because the entire scene was shaped by something that no official report could manipulate: the clear, sharp, undeniable truth preserved under a sun that refused to dim. Sheriff Wheeler, watching the footage spread online, felt the first tremor of panic inside his office as every major news network replayed the clip that showed Derek's gun pressed against Serena's ear. He called Travis. He called a county attorney. He called a local judge. But the window for control had closed the moment daylight recorded the crime. And when Naomi Park stepped into her mobile command trailer with the flash drive Marcus provided, she knew the sun had already done half her work. She would simply carry the truth the rest of the way. And by nightfall, the entire nation would see exactly what the sun had made impossible to hide. The federal courthouse in Pensacola filled before sunrise, not because people expected surprises, but because the nation already knew what daylight had revealed and wanted to witness the moment accountability walked into the room. Colonel Serena Washington entered slowly, guided by an aide, her balance still unsteady, her left ear covered by a small protective bandage that sheltered the wound that had stolen her hearing forever. She could not hear the whispers that rippled through the gallery. She could not hear the quiet gasp from a child when she took her seat. She could not hear the soft rustle of papers as attorneys positioned their notes. But she could see everything. She could see the faces leaning forward. She could see the deputies sitting at the defense table with rigid shoulders and lowered eyes. She could see the judge, stern and settled, waiting for the truth that had already been captured by 50 phones and a news helicopter. Serena lifted a whiteboard onto her lap, held a marker in her hand, and waited for the proceedings to begin. She was ready, even if her world remained silent. The prosecution opened with a statement so clear and measured that even the defense attorney shifted slightly in his chair, realizing he had entered a battle he could not win. The prosecutor reminded the jury that the shooting took place in broad daylight, that the victim held her hands high, and that the defendant, Deputy Derek Harlan, fired a weapon at an unarmed woman who had followed every command. He projected the first piece of evidence, a civilian's 4K video showing Serena standing beside her SUV, palms open, posture calm. The image froze mid-frame with the sunlight reflecting off her raised hands. The prosecutor let the silence settle for a moment before pressing play and letting the jury hear the gunshot. Serena did not react to the sound. Though she saw others flinch, her silence carried its own weight. It was the silence Derek had forced into her life with a single pull of the trigger. When Derek's attorney rose, he tried to present a story the jury had already rejected before he said a word. He spoke about fear. He spoke about misinterpretation. He spoke about sudden movement. But the daylight captured every motion with a clarity that left no room for invention. The prosecutor objected when the defense tried to introduce hypothetical scenarios, and the judge sustained the objections without hesitation. Derek shifted in his seat, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the table. He had worn the badge with a sense of invincibility for years. Now he faced a jury that knew exactly what he had done, a jury that had watched the videos the same way families across the country had watched them, a jury that understood that daylight had taken the place of testimony long before the trial began. When it came time for Serena to testify, The courtroom drew into a stillness so complete that even those in the hallway felt the gravity shift. She stood slowly, walked to the witness stand, and placed the whiteboard on her lap. The prosecutor asked her to describe what she remembered. Serena lifted the marker, her hand steady despite everything she had endured, and wrote simple, clear sentences. She turned the board toward the jury after every response. I complied with every instruction. She erased the words and wrote again. My hands were raised high. Another pause. He placed the gun against my ear. The courtroom remained silent, not out of restraint, but out of reverence for a woman whose voice had been stolen, yet whose truth rang louder than any spoken testimony. The defense attempted a cross-examination, but every question collapsed under the weight of the video evidence. When they suggested Serena might have moved suddenly, the prosecutor played a clip slowed to a fraction of its original speed. Serena's palms remained open, her body remained still, her shoulders never twitched. The defense attorney sat down within minutes. Defeated by the clarity of the footage, he had no path forward, no argument, no escape. Then came the moment the courtroom had anticipated since the first day of proceedings. The prosecutor played the helicopter recording. The jury watched from above as Serena stood with perfect compliance. Derek stepped forward, and the bullet tore through the air. The prosecutor replayed the scene frame by frame. Serena's hands, Derek's posture, the muzzle pressed against her ear, the flash, the collapse, not a shadow, not a blur, not a doubt. The prosecutor ended with a sentence spoken slowly, deliberately, and without emotion. This was not fear. This was a choice. Marcus Reed testified next. His voice shook when he identified himself, but he spoke with the clarity of a man who had carried shame for too long and was now determined to place the truth before the court without hesitation. He described Serena's actions during the stop. He described Derek's temper. He described 3 previous complaints the sheriff had buried. He described his own failure to intervene. The judge watched him with a measured expression, understanding the weight of confession in a courtroom built to reveal what institutions attempt to hide. When Marcus stepped down, the gallery exhaled as if a stone had been lifted from the collective chest of the room. His testimony did not merely indict Derek, it exposed the culture around him. The final blow came when the prosecution introduced the internal emails from the flash drive Marcus had surrendered, Wheeler's signature, Travis's instructions, deleted files, altered reports, manipulated timelines. The jury saw the network of silence in writing, each message illuminated on the large courtroom screen. The defense attempted no rebuttal. There was none possible. Closing arguments lasted less than 30 minutes. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Serena had served her country with courage, discipline, and honor. Yet her greatest danger came not from a battlefield abroad, but from a man sworn to protect civilians at home. The defense, out of options, asked the jury to consider complexity. But the jury had already seen the simplicity of truth under a bright sky. 4 hours after deliberations began, the jurors returned with verdicts that carried the weight of daylight. Derek Harlan, guilty on all counts, civil rights violation, attempted murder, aggravated assault under color of law, and obstruction, 12 years in federal custody. Sheriff Clayton Wheeler, guilty of conspiracy, evidence suppression, and failure to supervise, 8 years. Travis McAllister, guilty of tampering and obstruction, 5 years. Serena watched the reactions in silence. She could not hear the verdicts, but she saw justice settle across the room like the final beam of light closing the last shadow, and as the judge declared the sentences, Serena lifted her chin with quiet strength, knowing that the sunlight that had witnessed the crime had now witnessed the truth. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not cheer. It simply breathed in the clarity of accountability, earned, undeniable, and complete. And with that, the nation turned from shock to action, setting the stage for the reform that daylight would make impossible to avoid. The verdicts had barely settled before the sunlight that exposed the shooting began shaping something far larger than any courtroom. Because the country, staring at the frozen frame of Serena's raised hands, realized the crime was not an isolated act of violence but a symptom of a system protected by shadows for far too long. What made this case impossible to ignore was the clarity of the footage. No rain, no night, no blurred motion, only a black woman, unarmed and compliant, struck down under a bright sky that refused to let her death or survival be rewritten, within hours of the trial. Senators from both parties stood before cameras, each speaking with the somber recognition that the nation had reached a moral tipping point. They replayed the video during hearings. They replayed Serena's silent testimony. They replayed the helicopter footage that showed her hands visible from hundreds of feet above. The evidence was so clear, so public, and so unchallenged that Congress had no place to hide, and every attempt to delay was met by citizens holding up their phones, reminding lawmakers that the country had already rendered its own verdict. The Washington Reform Act moved through committee with unusual speed, pushed forward not by politics, but by the unmistakable clarity of what the sun had revealed. Testimony filled the Capitol. Families who had lost loved ones to unclear encounters finally saw their grief reflected in a case where nothing could be distorted. Experts presented data showing how body camera shutoffs aligned with force complaints. Civil rights leaders pointed out that officers who disabled cameras were often promoted instead of punished. Federal agents described the patterns of silence that shielded misconduct from oversight. And every time someone hesitated, someone else simply pressed play on the video of Serena standing with raised hands before the bullet turned her world to silence. It was the most damning evidence Congress had ever seen, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. The Act's first provision was simple and carried the force of common sense. Body cameras must be permanently linked to a central server and cannot be turned off by the wearer under any circumstance. The moment an officer begins a shift, their camera activates, remains active, and stores footage automatically. The second provision mandated real-time civilian oversight live streams in counties with a history of excessive force. Panels composed of retired judges, medical experts, veterans, and community leaders would watch high-risk encounters as they unfolded, eliminating the hours, or days, during which narratives could be altered. The third provision, the most debated, banned the use of deadly force against unarmed civilians unless there was an immediate and confirmed threat to the officer's life. No ambiguous gestures, no perceived danger, no vague claims of sudden movement. If the person was unarmed and compliant, the weapons stayed holstered. Critics argued that the rule placed officers at risk. Supporters argued that Serena's blood proved civilians had been the ones at risk for decades. In the end, the bill passed with a margin that surprised even the sponsors, a bipartisan recognition that daylight had already written the first draft of the law. Through all of this, Serena remained silent, not by choice, but by the lingering injury that had taken her hearing and left her in a world shaped by motion without sound. She watched congressional hearings from her hospital room. She read every caption displayed beneath senators' remarks. She followed every headline. She studied the bill's language with the same disciplined focus she brought to battlefield briefings. Her silence, once forced upon her, became a symbol of how the nation had failed to listen to voices like hers for generations. Yet now, through the very stillness created by her injury, she carried the weight of change. People saw her not as a political symbol, but as a woman whose life had been altered forever by a moment that should never have occurred. And they understood that reform was not about punishment alone, but about building structures that prevented future tragedies. when Serena left the hospital 2 months later. She entered a world that felt both familiar and transformed. Reporters met her with respectful distance. Veterans saluted her. Parents thanked her. Young cadets asked her for advice. But the moment that defined her path forward came from a letter written by a mother whose son had been killed in a nighttime stop where only the officer's version survived. The mother wrote, "Your daylight saved my son's truth. Even though he is gone, the sun that protected you has finally reached him." Serena read the letter twice, her eyes steady, her heart heavy with a responsibility she had not asked for but now embraced. She realized that her injury, her suffering, and her survival carried a purpose larger than any rank she had earned, with congressional support and national momentum behind her. Serena founded the Washington Initiative, a training and oversight organization aimed at reshaping police culture through discipline, transparency, and accountability. She believed in order, in structure, in clear expectations that left no room for ambiguity. She brought in veterans who understood operating under pressure without losing their humanity. She hired psychologists who specialized in stress responses. She worked with legal scholars who crafted policies resilient against manipulation. The training sessions were held outdoors, under bright Florida sunlight, as a symbolic reminder that integrity thrives where shadows cannot form. Recruits stood in open fields while instructors reviewed real footage, including Serena's own shooting, with direct, unflinching honesty. Serena never sensationalized the event. She simply presented the facts: a compliant civilian, a reckless officer, a moment that became a national reckoning. The initiative's early programs spread quickly across states seeking to rebuild trust. Departments that once resisted reform now adopted the model after pressure from citizens who demanded that transparency no longer be optional. Serena traveled frequently. Though she still struggled with dizziness from her injury, she communicated through spoken words when possible and through writing when necessary. But no matter the method, her message carried the same weight. Sunlight protects the innocent, and accountability protects the nation. She said it in every training. She said it at every hearing. She said it to every officer who tried to argue otherwise. She believed those words with the certainty of someone who had lived through both the violence of injustice and the power of truth. By the end of the year, the Washington Reform Act had been implemented nationwide, and Serena's initiative had trained more than 6,000 officers. Her influence reached beyond policing. Schools used the footage to teach civic responsibility. Military academies studied the case as an example of moral courage. Legal scholars described the trial as a demonstration of truth functioning as evidence beyond dispute, and families who had once been dismissed or ignored now had a language to demand clarity in their own cases. Through it all, Serena carried her silence with dignity. She could not hear applause. She could not hear debate. She could not hear gratitude, but she could see change unfolding in front of her. She could see lives protected by policies that had been born from her suffering. She could see officers accepting accountability not as punishment but as duty, and she could see, with quiet certainty, that the nation had finally learned something the sun had tried to teach all along. When truth stands in daylight, reform follows, and in that simple truth, a new era of policing began, born not from politics or pressure, but from a moment the sun refused to let the country forget. 1 year after the shooting, under the same bright Florida sun that had exposed everything, a quiet gathering formed at mile marker 52 on Interstate 10, where Colonel Serena Washington had fallen to the pavement and risen into national memory. The traffic moved slowly around the closed median, drivers lifting their phones as they passed, unaware that they were witnessing the final chapter of a story the country had not been able to ignore. At the center of the space stood a simple granite marker, waist high, polished to a soft sheen that caught the afternoon light. Its inscription faced the eastbound lanes, so every traveler could see the words as they entered the stretch of highway where Serena's life changed forever. She drove into the sun. They tried to put her in darkness. The light refused. Serena approached the stone with measured steps, her balance still uneven, her hearing gone forever, but her posture steady with the pride of someone who had survived not only a bullet, but a country's long struggle to confront the truth. She touched the top edge of the marker with gentle fingertips, tracing the carved letters in silence. Around her stood Captain Isaiah Brooks, Dr. Elias Grant, Lydia Reed holding her infant daughter, Special Agent Naomi Park, and dozens of veterans who had traveled from across the state to honor the woman whose suffering forced reforms they had long prayed for. Serena could not hear the murmurs of respect that passed through the crowd, but she could see the tears, the bowed heads, the small gestures of gratitude carried by people who understood that she had paid a price no citizen should ever pay to make a nation safer. A pastor stepped forward and spoke, his voice firm yet soft, recognizing that Serena's silence had become a national symbol rather than a limitation. He spoke about courage under fire, about truth revealed in daylight, about the way a single moment can change the direction of a country. Serena watched his lips move while Isaiah held a small tablet that displayed live captions so she could follow the message. The pastor ended with a simple line that stood out even on the screen. The sun recorded what the world needed to see. Serena lifted her head slightly at those words, because she knew they held the spirit of the year that followed her injury. The hearings, the verdicts, the new law, the Washington Initiative, the thousands of officers who now trained under standards shaped by her blood, her silence, and her survival. After the pastor stepped back, Lydia Reed approached the stone with her daughter in her arms. The baby was almost a year old, alive only because Serena had saved Lydia during the hostage crisis long before the shooting. Lydia placed a single white lily at the base of the marker. She whispered something Serena could not hear, but Serena understood the meaning from the look in Lydia's eyes. A look of gratitude mixed with sorrow, a look that recognized how violence and heroism had collided in ways neither woman had asked for. Marcus Reed stood behind his wife, hands clasped, carrying the weight of his own guilt and redemption. He had testified, he had revealed the hidden files. He had broken the silence inside his department. Today he stood with quiet dignity, knowing that truth requires courage long after a courtroom empties. Serena gave him a small nod, acknowledging that his choice had helped save her life as surely as Elias's hands on the pavement. As the ceremony continued, drivers slowed as they passed, holding their phones out the window, capturing Serena beside the granite marker. Some recognized her instantly. Others simply sensed the solemnity and recorded the moment without knowing its full meaning. Serena did not mind. She understood that the memorial was not built for applause or attention. It was built because the truth needed a place to stand. The stone, placed carefully in the median, cast a thin shadow behind it. Yet even that shadow never touched the faint, permanent discoloration in the asphalt where her blood had pooled on the day she was shot. Engineers had painted over the stain several times during repairs, but the outline always reappeared in the heat, as if the highway itself refused to let the memory fade. Serena looked at that faint mark now, and for a moment she felt the weight of the year settle into her chest. The doctors, the dizziness, the sleepless nights, the moments of profound silence that followed her everywhere. And yet she felt something else as well. Resolve, steady and unwavering, when it was her turn to speak. She stepped to the front, holding a small tablet where she had typed her remarks. Naomi connected the tablet to a small speaker so the crowd could hear her words read aloud by a clear digital voice. Serena had learned to communicate without sound, but she refused to let silence diminish truth. The voice spoke slowly, carrying her message with calm force. She thanked the crowd. She honored the victims whose stories had never received the clarity hers had. She reminded everyone that reform was not a finish line, but a duty renewed with every sunrise. And she ended with the sentence she had carried with her since the day she touched the Washington Reform Act with her own hands. The sun does not take sides. It only reveals what people choose to do. The crowd bowed their heads. Serena looked toward the sky, feeling warmth on her face, and knew the moment had come to walk forward. She placed her hand on the stone one last time, then stepped back as the afternoon light settled across the highway in a gentle, unwavering glow. The memorial would remain. The truth would remain. The stain would remain. And the nation, now changed, would carry her story into every future debate about justice, accountability, and the cost of silence. As she turned away with Isaiah beside her, the sun followed her path, steady and bright, as if guarding the memory of the day it refused to let the world forget. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and give the video a like so more people can hear the truth.